Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Beckidge, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Sanders, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Durbin. I don't have it, all right. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Yes. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mrs. Feinstein?
Maybe.
Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Rubio, no.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the vote is 78 yeas, 16 nays. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Jeh Charles Johnson of New Jersey to be Secretary of Homeland Security, signed by 18 senators.
Pursuant to Rule 22, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
A quorum is present. The Majority Leader? A quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Jeh Charles Johnson of New Jersey to be Secretary of Homeland Security shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Yes. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. I would have said that. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo,
I'm sorry, I'm no one. Cloture, I thought it was fine. I'm no one.
Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane,
Wait.
Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar,
Thanks, sir.
Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow.
So you'd be standing there.
Mr. Chester. Mr. Thune.
He likes that.
Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico.
Does he realize what
Mr. Bitter.
Does he realize what I'm
Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Warren, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Toomey, Wicker. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Branken, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye.
Are there any senators who have not voted who want to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 57, the nays are 37. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
can we have quiet, order?
The Senate will be in order. Please clear the well. The Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I have one unanimous consent request for committee to meet during today's session. It has approval of both Senator McConnell and me. I ask consent this request be agreed to and printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the remaining votes this evening be 10 minutes in duration.
Is there any objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Homeland Security, Jeh Charles Johnson of New Jersey to be Secretary of Homeland Security.
Closure having been invoked under the previous order, all post-closure time is yielded back, and the question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, gotcha. Mr. Barrasso. Ayotte. Boxer. Mr. Katzman. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand.
I'm ruling you out of order.
I mean, he thanks that guy.
Mr. Graham.
Good job, tell people to.
Mr. Grassley.
Pretty well, guys.
Mrs. Hagan.
Have you ordered pizza?
Not yet.
You can order pizza.
Mr. Harkin.
Tester has. Leave it up to you if you want to call it.
Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich.
Did you really?
Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller.
I expect they could put their head under this.
I'm not really sure what the plan is.
Or like sneeze.
You know, I vote on this.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Flake.
It's on the stick.
Mr. Hoven.
Maybe bacon. In your,
Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions.
because we're going to keep this.
Here's your first one. Now keep the numbers next to it.
Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico.
It's all good.
Okay, we'll take a look at it. Make sure I did everything to your liking.
Mr. Bennett. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Harper, Casey, Chambliss,
Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Flake, Gillibrand, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Mikulski, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Nevada, Roberts, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Bozeman, Cornyn, Crapo, Fisher, Inhofe, McConnell, Portman, Risch, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, and Shelby. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye.
Do you want your absentees? Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. I got you. Mr. Franken, aye.
I did the other one.
You did the other. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 78, the nays are 16, and the nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
We have order, Mr. We have order, Mr. President.
He just wants to stand up and show what he supports.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there objection? No objection, so ordered.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider count number 456.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
No. I want a little more decisiveness.
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett.
Hey, I watched the soccer. So we got to try to get him.
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer.
Why don't we do that?
Mr. Brown.
We'll do that together. I'll contact him. That's exciting. Very exciting. Yeah. There is no incident for this, but there's also
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
Can you email it to me? I'm going to lose that piece of paper. Yeah. You're going to lose it. Who's your invite over? John Smith?
Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons.
Hey, Bill Stern. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Well, they're at the bottom.
Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz.
What time we stop?
Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin.
Okay, take that.
Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein.
We got more coming?
Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley,
All right, well, I'm watching you here.
Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin,
I'll wait for that invitation.
Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King,
It's been a long night.
Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Wyden. Mr. Cardin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Bozeman, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Wicker. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 53, the nays are 38. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I sent a cloture.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro